Have you ever witnessed a moment so defying all logic that it stopped you completely in your tracks, forcing you to question everything you thought you knew about survival, instinct, and the raw power of will? Picture this: a wolf, wounded and cornered, surrounded on all sides by hunters who had tracked it for miles through unforgiving terrain. Every exit blocked, every escape route covered. The odds, impossible. The outcome, already written, or so everyone thought. Because in that frozen moment when every law of nature screamed at that animal to run, to fight, to flee, it simply didn't move. It stood its ground, still, silent, unbroken. That image alone is enough to send a chill down your spine. And if you're anything like me, the first question that explodes in your mind is, why? Why would a cornered animal, one with every biological instinct wired for survival, choose to stay? What was happening inside that creature in what should have been its final moments? Was it fear that paralyzed it, or something far more powerful than fear? This is exactly what we're going to explore today, and what you're about to discover might genuinely surprise you. Not just because of what happened in that field, surrounded by hunters with nowhere left to turn, but because of what that moment reveals about instinct, psychology, and the kind of quiet, unshakable courage that most living beings, human or animal, rarely ever access. Stay with me, because this goes much deeper than a simple wildlife story. We often think of survival in purely physical terms: speed, strength, strategy. We assume that when danger closes in, the only intelligent response is to escape it. Run faster, fight harder, find the gap and take it. That's the script we've been handed since childhood, reinforced by every nature documentary, every survival guide, every hero's journey we've ever consumed. But what if that script is incomplete? What if, in certain extraordinary circumstances, the most powerful move available isn't movement at all? There's something profoundly unsettling and at the same time deeply fascinating about a creature that refuses to be defined by its circumstances. About a being that looks impossibility dead in the eye and doesn't blink. Have you ever felt that kind of pressure in your own life? That suffocating feeling of being surrounded, with no clear way forward, where every option seems worse than the last? If you have, then what happened with this wolf is going to resonate with you on a level that goes way beyond the animal kingdom. Because this story isn't just about a wolf and a group of hunters in the wilderness. It's about something universal, something that lives in the space between panic and peace, between surrender and defiance. It's about what happens in the mind, in the body, in the very soul of a living being when it reaches the absolute edge of everything it knows. The hunters had done everything right. They had planned, positioned, and closed in with precision. By every measurable standard, the hunt was over. And yet, something unexpected unfolded in that clearing that none of them were prepared for. Something that would stay with each of those men long after they left that place. What you're about to find out will challenge the way you think about fear, about instinct, and maybe even about yourself. Keep watching, because the real story is just beginning. Before we go any further into what actually happened in that clearing, because trust me, the details are extraordinary, I want to take just a moment to step outside the story and speak directly to you. If you've made it this far, it tells me something about who you are. You're not someone who scrolls past the surface. You're someone who wants to understand why things happen, not just what happened. And that kind of curiosity is exactly what this channel was built for. So here's what I want to ask you, genuinely and without any script. Has a story like this ever made you stop and think about a moment in your own life when you were surrounded by pressure, by doubt, by circumstances that seemed completely out of your control? A moment where everything was closing in, and somehow, something inside you held firm. If that resonates with you, even just a little, I want you to drop it in the comments right now. Tell me what that moment was. Tell me what you felt. Tell me whether you ran, or whether, like this wolf, you stood your ground. Those comments mean more than you might realize, not just to me, but to every single person who watches this video and scrolls down looking for a sign that they're not alone in what they've felt. Your words might be exactly the thing someone else needed to read today. That's the kind of community I want to build here, one where real stories, real emotions, and real connections matter. And if this kind of content speaks to you, if you believe that there's something deeply important in exploring the hidden lessons that nature, animals, and extraordinary moments have to teach us about our own humanity, then please hit that like button. It sounds simple, but that small gesture is what tells the algorithm that this story deserves to reach more people. Every like is a vote that says, this matters. This is worth sharing. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect moment. Not because of some arbitrary number on a screen, but because there are more stories like this one waiting for you. Stories that don't just entertain, but genuinely make you feel something. Stories that stay with you. When you subscribe, you become part of something larger than a single video. You're joining a space where we slow down, we pay attention, and we ask the questions that most people are too busy to ask. Your participation here, your comment, your like, your subscription, is what keeps this channel alive and growing. It's what allows these stories to travel further, to reach the person sitting alone somewhere who needs to hear exactly this, at exactly this moment. That's not a small thing. That's actually everything. So thank you, genuinely. Now, back to the wolf. Because what happened next in that clearing is the part that no one who was there that day has ever been able to fully explain. The hunters had their weapons raised. The circle was tight, and yet not a single one of them took the shot. Something shifted in that space, something invisible, something that had nothing to do with tactics or terrain. And understanding what that was and why it happened is going to take us somewhere unexpected. The forest was the kind of place that makes you feel small the moment you step into it. Not small in a poetic way, small in the way that matters, the way that reminds every cell in your body that you are a guest here, and that the rules you live by out in the open world simply do not apply between these trees. The canopy overhead was so dense that the afternoon light barely made it through, filtering down in thin, broken shafts that barely touched the ground before being swallowed by shadow. The undergrowth was thick and tangled, the kind that grabs at your ankles and slows every step, as if the forest itself is reluctant to let you move freely through it. The air had a weight to it, humid, heavy, carrying the smell of wet earth and something older, something that had been living and decaying and being reborn in that same soil for longer than any of the men walking through it had been alive. There are forests that feel neutral. There are forests that feel welcoming, that make you want to sit down beneath a tree and stay a while. And then there are forests like this one, forests that press in on you, that make the silence feel charged, that make every snapped twig underfoot sound like a gunshot, and every distant rustling in the brush feel like a warning. This was that kind of forest, and the men moving through it knew it. They had been tracking for hours. The team was experienced. These were not weekend hobbyists with new boots and borrowed equipment. These were men who knew how to read the land, how to follow a trail that most eyes would never even see, how to move in coordinated silence through difficult terrain without losing formation or focus. They communicated in glances and subtle hand gestures, the language of people who have spent enough time in the field together that words become unnecessary. Each of them carried that particular kind of focused calm that comes not from the absence of tension, but from years of learning how to carry tension without letting it show. The trail they had been following was unmistakable once you knew what to look for. Compressed earth in a specific pattern, disturbed leaves, a broken branch at exactly the wrong height. Tracks that told a story of movement, purposeful, steady, unhurried. Whatever they were following had not been running. It had been walking. And that detail, small as it sounds, had been quietly unsettling the more experienced members of the group since they first picked up the trail. Because an animal that knows it's being hunted and still doesn't run isn't behaving like prey. And an animal that doesn't behave like prey introduces a variable that experienced hunters respect deeply and are wary of. The silence between them grew thicker as the trail grew fresher. There is a particular quality to silence in a forest when something is very close. It's not the absence of sound. Birds still call occasionally. The wind still moves through the upper branches with a low, constant murmur. It's more like a compression of sound, like everything in the immediate vicinity is holding its breath. The men felt it. Not one of them said anything about it, but each of them felt it, and each of them instinctively slowed their pace and sharpened their attention in response. And then they found the clearing. It opened up with almost no warning. One moment there was nothing but trees and undergrowth and filtered shadow, and then the vegetation simply pulled back, and there it was, a roughly circular space where the canopy thinned and actual daylight fell to the ground in a wide, pale column. The grass was longer here, undisturbed. A cluster of large stones sat near the far edge, and the ground around them was soft. It was the kind of place that feels, for reasons you can't quite articulate, like it has been used before, like it holds something. The wolf was at the center of it, and beside the wolf, so close that their proximity was immediately viscerally shocking, was a child. In the disorienting first seconds of seeing that scene, the brain struggles to assemble it into something coherent. The image resists interpretation. A wolf, a child, side by side. The child sitting on the ground with her legs folded beneath her, her small frame relaxed, her head tilted slightly in the wolf's direction. The wolf standing, not crouched, not coiled, not in any posture that suggested aggression or defensiveness, just standing, its large body positioned between the child and the line of trees from which the hunters had just emerged, its eyes fixed on the men with an expression that seemed to contain something far more complex than simple animal wariness. She was young, perhaps 4 years old, perhaps 5. It was difficult to tell from a distance, and in that moment, precise age was not the thing that struck you. What struck you was her size, the smallness of her, the delicacy of her hands resting in her lap, the roundness of her face, the way her hair had been pulled back imperfectly, as though someone had done it in a hurry that morning and a few strands had worked their way loose. She was wearing a light-colored jacket that was dirty at the knees, and one of her shoes had come partially untied. She looked like a child who had been playing outside, not like a child who had been lost in a forest, which made the scene even more deeply confusing. She didn't look frightened. She didn't look distressed. She looked in a way that was almost more unsettling than anything else, comfortable. And the wolf, wounded, as they could now see clearly, stood over her with the patient, deliberate stillness of something that has made a decision and is not interested in negotiating it. The hunters spread out instinctively, moving to positions along the edge of the clearing, maintaining distance, keeping the targets. In their sightlines, hands tightened on weapons, safeties were checked. The formation closed in slowly, not rushing, not alarming, but moving with the controlled precision of people who understand that sudden movements in moments like these can trigger outcomes that cannot be undone. The circle narrowed. 20 meters. 15. The far side of the clearing was blocked. The trees behind the wolf offered no meaningful exit. By every tactical measure that any of them had been trained to apply, the situation was resolved. The animal was surrounded. There was nowhere left to go. And the wolf did not move. It didn't growl. There was no baring of teeth, no low warning rumble in the chest, no shift in weight that suggested the preparation for attack or the gathering of momentum for flight. It simply stood, and it watched. Its yellow eyes moved calmly from one man to the next, not in the rapid, panicked scanning of a trapped animal, but in the slow, deliberate assessment of something that is processing information and drawing conclusions. It was the gaze of something that understood what it was looking at, and that understanding, visible, undeniable, communicating itself across the distance between species, was the thing that made the first man lower his weapon slightly without fully realizing he had done so. the second man noticed. He didn't lower his own weapon, but his finger moved away from the trigger by a fraction of an inch. Not a decision exactly. More like the beginning of a question. Here is the thing about human beings in high-pressure situations that we don't often acknowledge honestly. We are not nearly as rational as we like to believe. We tell ourselves a story about decision-making, that it's logical, sequential, driven by information and training and clear-headed assessment. And that story is partly true, but it leaves out the massive, invisible role that instinct plays. That gut-level, pre-verbal, faster-than-thought response that your nervous system generates before your conscious mind has finished assembling the sentence. In moments of genuine high stakes, it is that deeper system, the ancient one, the one you share with every living creature that has ever had to make a split-second call in a dangerous situation, that often speaks first. And what it said to every man in that clearing, in the half-second after they registered the full picture of what they were seeing, was something close to, wait, not run, not shoot, not retreat, just wait. There was something happening in that clearing that exceeded the boundaries of the scenario they had prepared for, something that the tactical part of their training had no protocol to address. Because their training had prepared them for animals that behave like animals under pressure, that respond to encirclement with either aggression or flight, that operate from a relatively predictable menu of survival behaviors. It had not prepared them for this, an animal that appeared for all the world to have made a choice. A deliberate, considered, emotionally grounded choice to remain exactly where it was, regardless of the consequences. The concept of an animal making a choice the way a human makes a choice is one that science has long been cautious about. We have a deep cultural habit of projecting human emotional and cognitive frameworks onto animal behavior, of seeing in a dog's expression the full complexity of human guilt, or reading in a crow's problem-solving the kind of conscious intentionality that we associate with our own thinking. And the scientific community has reasonably pushed back against this tendency, urging us to be careful about anthropomorphizing, about overlaying our own inner experience onto beings whose inner lives we cannot directly access. It is good science. It is important caution. And yet, there are moments, and the men in that clearing were living through one of them, where the behavior of an animal produces an effect that cannot be explained simply by dismissing the complexity of what seems to be happening inside it, where something in the posture, the gaze, the deliberateness of the stillness communicates something that lands in the observer as unmistakably intentional. Not because we are projecting, but because whatever that animal is doing is genuinely, functionally analogous to what a conscious decision looks like from the outside. The wolf was protecting the child, not because it had been trained to, not because it was cornered, and the child happened to be nearby. The geometry of its body told the story plainly. It had positioned itself between the child and the hunters with the kind of spatial precision that implies awareness of threat direction. Its body was angled to maximize coverage. Its attention was directed outward toward the approaching men, while the child behind it remained, from the wolf's perspective, in the safest possible position, shielded, close, and not yet visible as a primary concern, to whatever was coming from the tree line. This was not accident. This was not coincidence of positioning. This was architecture. The wolf had arranged itself in space with reference to both the threat and the thing it was protecting. And that arrangement, that deliberately chosen geometry of protection, was what had stopped every finger in that clearing from completing its motion. Let's sit with that for a moment, because it matters more than it might initially seem. The transformation happening in that clearing was not just about a wolf behaving unusually. It was about a group of trained, experienced, focused individuals having their entire understanding of the situation fundamentally restructured by a single piece of information that didn't fit the model they had arrived with. And that restructuring, that moment when the mind has to scrap its existing framework and build a new one fast, is one of the most genuinely disorienting experiences a human being can have. We operate, most of the time, inside frameworks we're not even aware of. Mental models about how things work, about what certain situations mean, about what behavior in a particular context implies about intention. These models are incredibly useful. They allow us to process complex environments quickly, to make fast decisions, to function without being paralyzed by the need to analyze everything from scratch every single time. But they have a critical vulnerability. When reality produces something that doesn't fit the model doesn't automatically update. First, it resists. It tries to assimilate the anomaly, to fit the unexpected data into the existing structure. And only when that fails, only when the anomaly is too large, too persistent, too undeniably real to be ignored, does the framework finally crack open and begin to rebuild. That cracking is what was happening, simultaneously, inside every person in that clearing. One of the hunters, a man who had been in the field for over 2 decades, who had faced genuinely dangerous animals in difficult circumstances and had always maintained the cool, methodical composure that had kept him safe, later described what he experienced in those moments as something he had no adequate language for. He said it was like the ground shifted, not physically, not literally, but in the way that the meaning of what he was looking at shifted. Like a word you've read 1,000 times that suddenly looks wrong on the page. And the more you stare at it, the more alien it becomes, until you can't quite remember what it means. He said he had been in that forest to do a specific thing, with a specific understanding of what that thing required, and in the space of about 30 seconds, that understanding had become unavailable to him, not because he had changed his mind, but because the scene in front of him had revealed itself to be something other than what he had believed it to be, and the thing it actually was did not accommodate the action he had come prepared to take. He lowered his weapon. Others followed, not in unison, not with any signal or instruction, but in the organic, sequential way that a shift in collective understanding moves through a group when no one has the words for it yet. One person processes it first, their body responds before their mind has finished the sentence, and that response becomes visible to the others. And something in the visibility of it gives permission for the same response to move through them. The circle did not close further, and in the center of it, the wolf stood its ground. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because the behavioral dimension of what that wolf was doing opens up into territory that researchers, naturalists, and wildlife behaviorists have been genuinely grappling with for years. Territory that challenges some of our most basic assumptions about the boundary between instinct and something that begins to look, functionally, like moral reasoning. Wild wolves are social animals. This is well established. They live in structured family units. They cooperate in hunting. They communicate in sophisticated ways. They demonstrate behaviors that appear to reflect emotional bonds, grief at loss, joy at reunion, protectiveness toward the young and vulnerable within their group. The literature on wolf social behavior is rich, detailed, and genuinely compelling in what it reveals about the complexity of their inner lives. Wolves form attachments. They demonstrate what appears functionally to be loyalty. They make sacrifices, real, measurable, costly sacrifices for the members of their pack. But this child was not a member of its pack. This is the detail that shifts everything and takes the story somewhere that none of the standard behavioral frameworks can easily contain. Because what the wolf was doing, positioning itself as a shield, maintaining that position under direct threat, refusing to prioritize its own survival over the protection of a small being that had no biological claim on its loyalty, was not behavior that could be explained by the standard architecture of wolf social bonding. It wasn't protecting one of its own. It wasn't operating from a hardwired imperative to preserve a genetic line or secure the future of its pack. It was protecting something outside all of those categories, something small and vulnerable and completely unrelated to its own survival calculus. And it was doing so at what appeared to be genuine personal cost. The wound was visible, not catastrophic. The animal was standing, its weight distributed evenly, its movement uncompromised, but real. An injury that would have been felt, That would have made every instinctive calculation in that animal's system tip sharply toward the most conservative, self-preserving option available. In pure survivalist terms, the wolf's best move was clear: abandon the child, use the opening, disappear into the trees. The hunters were focused on the scene in front of them. A fast wolf with a head start and the cover of that forest had a genuine chance. The math of escape was available. The wolf did not take it. There is a word that human beings use when we describe this kind of behavior in ourselves: devotion. We use it to describe the parent who runs back into a burning building, the soldier who covers a grenade, the stranger who dives into a current to pull out someone they've never met. We use it to describe the decision, if you can even call it a decision, given how little conscious deliberation appears to be involved, to place the survival of another above the survival of yourself, not because of obligation, not because of contract, not because of consequence, but because of something that operates at a level deeper than all of those things, something that, when it's present, makes the self-preserving option genuinely unavailable. Not because you've suppressed it, but because, in that moment, the other person's survival is your survival, in some functional, felt sense that overrides the narrow biological arithmetic. Can a wolf feel that? Can any non-human animal? The question is older than the science that attempts to answer it, and the honest answer, the one that the best researchers in the field will give you when they're being rigorous and humble at the same time, is that we don't fully know. We know that animals demonstrate behaviors that are functionally analogous to what we would call devotion in a human context. We know that the neurochemical substrates of social bonding, oxytocin, vasopressin, dopamine, are not uniquely human. We know that the capacity for something that looks and operates like love, like loyalty, like grief, is distributed far more widely across the animal kingdom than the dominant cultural narrative of the 20th century was willing to acknowledge. What we are less certain about is the inner dimension, the felt experience, whether there is something it is like to be that wolf, standing in that clearing, wounded and surrounded and unwilling to leave. Whether the stillness is accompanied by something that resembles, in any meaningful sense, the conscious experience of choosing to stay. Whether there is, behind those yellow eyes fixed on the approaching hunters, something that a human being would recognize as resolve. But here is what I find myself returning to every time I think about this story. What would it change if there was? What would it mean about the nature of loyalty if loyalty is not uniquely ours? What would it mean about the nature of courage if courage can live in a body that has no language for it, no cultural framework to contain it, no tradition of stories about what it means to be brave? What would it mean about the nature of love, in its most stripped-down, essential, pre-linguistic form, if love can exist in a being that has never been told what love is? I think it would mean that these things are older than we are, that they predate us, that what we experience as our highest, most distinctively human qualities, the capacity to put another first, to hold the line when everything says to run, to be present for a vulnerable life, even when presence costs everything, are not inventions of human culture, not products of our particular kind of consciousness, but expressions of something that runs deeper and wider and older than anything we built. Something the universe was doing long before we arrived to name it. And if that's true, it changes the way you look at every story like this one. There's a concept in psychology that researchers sometimes call altruistic behavior under threat, the documented tendency across multiple species for individuals to engage in protective actions toward vulnerable others, even when those actions carry significant personal risk. In humans, this has been studied extensively in the context of bystander intervention, emergency response, wartime, behavior, and parental sacrifice. The findings are complicated. Humans are capable of extraordinary selflessness and also of extraordinary passivity in the face of others' suffering, and the variables that determine which response emerges in a given moment are subtle and still not fully understood. In non-human animals, the documentation of analogous behavior is more recent and more contested, but it exists. Elephants have been observed remaining with injured members of their group far beyond any point where continued presence served their own interests. Dolphins have been documented supporting sick or dying pod members at the surface for hours or days, keeping them from drowning. Crows have been observed returning to mourn their dead in ways that appear to serve no survival function whatsoever. But that look from the outside, very much like grief. Dogs, domesticated, yes, which complicates the baseline, have produced hundreds of documented cases of protective behavior toward humans and other animals that went far beyond any training or reward structure. And wolves, wild wolves in documented field observations, have been recorded on multiple occasions behaving in ways that suggest something more than simple pack loyalty. Protecting animals outside their immediate group, tolerating the presence of vulnerable individuals, injured deer, lost young of other species, in ways that their predatory nature would not seem to predict. Not always, not consistently, but enough times and in enough circumstances similar enough to be notable that the researchers who study them take these incidents seriously rather than dismissing them as anomalies. The wound matters here in a specific way that's worth examining, because an injured animal operates from a different risk calculus than a healthy one. The cost-benefit analysis of any given action shifts when your physical capacity is compromised, when running is harder, when fighting is more costly, when the margin of error that the body can absorb before the outcome becomes irreversible has narrowed. An injured animal, in most behavioral models, should be more likely to prioritize self-preservation, not less. The injury creates pressure toward caution, toward the avoidance of additional risk, toward the most conservative option on the menu. The wolf did the opposite. It took the most expensive option available. It planted itself between danger and vulnerability and held that position without flinching. Despite injury, despite encirclement, despite every message, its own nervous system must have been generating about the state it was in and the threat it was facing. And it did this not for 30 seconds, not in the first flush of a defensive impulse that faded quickly. It held. For the entire duration of that standoff, which stretched longer than anyone in that clearing had expected, it held. That duration is important, because it moves the behavior out of the category of impulse and into something that looks more like sustained intention. A protective impulse can be automatic, reflexive, precognitive, the hand that shoots out to catch a falling glass before the conscious mind has registered that the glass is falling. But a sustained protective stance, maintained across time under ongoing threat, with ongoing cost, that begins to look like something the animal is doing, in the fullest sense, something it is actively, continuously choosing to maintain. The hunters felt this. Not in theoretical terms. They were not standing in that clearing, running philosophical analyses of animal cognition. They felt it the way you feel the weight of a gaze that refuses to drop, the way you feel the presence of something that is not afraid of you, not in spite of understanding the situation, but because of it. There is a particular quality to being looked at by something that has assessed the risk, acknowledged the cost, and decided anyway. It communicates something directly to the nervous system, without passing through language. It doesn't ask your opinion. It simply arrives. And somewhere in the extended stillness of that standoff, one of the men, perhaps the one who had lowered his weapon first, perhaps another, became aware of something he had not fully registered in the initial shock of the scene. Something small and specific, and, once noticed, impossible to unnotice. The child had not made a sound, not when the hunters emerged from the tree line, not when the circle closed, not when weapons were raised and the air in the clearing became that particular flavor of tense that adults recognize as dangerous. Through all of it, through every second of what was, by any objective measure, an extremely frightening scene for a small child to be present in, she had not cried, had not called out, had not reached for the wolf, had not tried to move away from it, had not looked around in the wide-eyed, searching panic that a lost or frightened child produces. She had been still, not the stillness of shock, not the frozen immobility of a child too frightened to move, It was the stillness of someone who was, on some deep and unargued level, not afraid. The stillness of someone who did not experience the scene around her as threatening because the thing she was with had communicated something to her in whatever language exists between a child and a wild animal that had made fear unnecessary. She trusted the wolf, completely, unreservedly, in the way that children trust before they have been taught to calculate trustworthiness, before they have been given the adult tools of skepticism and risk assessment and the cautious management of vulnerability. In the way that bypasses all of that and goes straight to the thing underneath, the thing that existed before any of us had a word for it. And the wolf, for its part, had done nothing to violate that trust, had not used the child as a shield in any cynical sense, had not hidden behind her, had not leveraged her presence as a deterrent in a tactical way that prioritized its own escape. It had positioned itself as her shield. The geometry ran in one direction, the wolf between the threat and the child, not the other way around. Whatever calculation, if you can call it that, the wolf had made, it had been made in her favor, at its own expense. The revelation of this detail, the silence of the child, the completeness of her trust, the direction of the wolf's protection, did something to the dynamic of that clearing that no tactical development could have done. It didn't just pause the action, it reframed it. It took what had appeared, for the first 30 seconds, to be a scene about a dangerous animal and a group of people whose job was to address that danger, and revealed it to be something else entirely. Something that none of the men there had any established framework for. Something that asked them, without using words, to be different kinds of people than the ones they had been when they walked into that forest. The journey that brings a group of trained, purposeful, well-equipped individuals to a complete stop, not because of force, not because of threat, not because of any external compulsion, but because of the sheer, wordless moral weight of what they are witnessing, is a journey worth understanding. Because it is, in miniature, the same journey that every human transformation requires. The journey from the person who acts inside the framework they arrived with, to the person who is capable of recognizing when a new framework is needed and is willing to accept the disorientation of building one. That disorientation is real. It is not comfortable. The frameworks we carry are not just cognitive tools. They are, to a significant degree, identity. The way we understand situations is bound up with the way we understand ourselves. To have a situation reveal itself as something other than what you believed it to be is, in a very real sense, to have a piece of your self-understanding revealed as incomplete. And the mind resists this. The ego resists this. There is a deep and genuine discomfort in the moment when you recognize that the model you arrived with cannot contain what you're looking at, and that moving forward requires building a new one with no guarantee of what it will look like when it's done. The men in that clearing were living through exactly that. They had arrived as hunters. They had a job. They had training that had produced over years a particular way of reading situations like this one and knowing what to do in them. And now all of that, every bit of it, was suspended, not by force, but by the image of a wounded wolf standing in silent, unwavering protection over a child who was not afraid. There is a particular kind of courage that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't come with raised voice or dramatic gesture or the visible markers we associate with bravery. It is the courage of the thing that simply stays. That absorbs the pressure without expressing it. That does not perform its commitment, but simply enacts it continuously in the face of everything that says this is the wrong calculation. That kind of courage is harder to recognize because it doesn't have the shape we've been taught to look for. But once you learn to see it, you find it everywhere. In the people who show up again and again without celebration, in the quiet endurance that holds the line when no one is watching, in the beings, human and otherwise, who have decided at some level that operates below language that there is something worth staying for. The wolf had decided. And in the weight of that decision, held still in the pale light of that clearing, while men with weapons stood in a circle around it, something shifted in the air that was not tactical, not physical, not anything that any training manual has ever attempted to address. Something that belonged to a different category of experience. Entirely. The category that deals not with what we do, but with who we are, and with the moments that reveal the difference between those two things more clearly than we are usually comfortable seeing. The child remained still. The wolf remained still. The hunters remained still. And for a moment that seemed, to every person present, to last much longer than the clock would confirm. The whole clearing held its breath. Sometimes the most important thing that can happen in a high-pressure situation is nothing. Not the nothing of paralysis or failure, but the nothing of recognition. The pause that comes when reality has presented you with something that exceeds your framework, and the wisest available response is to stop, to witness, to let the meaning of what you're seeing assemble itself without forcing it into a shape it doesn't fit. That pause is itself a kind of transformation, a hidden one that doesn't make headlines or produce dramatic footage, but one that changes, in some cases permanently, the person who passes through it. Every man in that clearing was passing through it, and what they were passing through, what the wolf had, in its silence and its stillness and its wounded, unwavering presence made possible for them, was a confrontation with a truth that most of us spend a very long time avoiding. The truth that protection is not always loud, that courage is not always visible, that the most powerful things that exist between living beings, the loyalty that cannot be explained, the love that exceeds its own cost, the willingness to stand between danger and vulnerability without guarantee and without performance, often have no words and need none. The child had known this from the beginning. That's what her silence had been saying all along. Drop a comment right now and write, "I felt this." If this story reached something real in you, if it stirred something you recognize, something you felt in your own life, let me know. Because the conversation this opens up is one worth having together. If you made it to this point, I want you to know something. That means more than you might think. Not everyone stays. Not everyone slows down enough to sit with a story like this one, to follow it through all of its layers, to let it land the way it was meant to. You did. And that tells me we're the kind of people who are drawn to the same things, to the questions underneath the surface, to the moments that reveal something true about what it means to be alive and connected and responsible to something beyond ourselves. So if this story moved you, if something in it touched a place you recognize, I'd love for you to leave a comment right now with the words, "This one stayed with me." That's all, just that. Because I read those comments, and knowing that a story like this one found the right person on the other side of the screen is genuinely what makes the work worth doing. And if you feel like this video earned it, if the time you spent here felt worthwhile, a like goes a long way. Not in a transactional sense, but in the very real, practical sense that it helps this kind of content reach more people who would appreciate it. People who are looking for exactly this, without knowing yet where to find it. That like is how they find it. If you're not subscribed yet, this is a quiet invitation to change that. No pressure, just the simple idea that if this is the kind of content that speaks to you, there's more of it here, and it keeps coming. Stories, moments, questions worth sitting with. The kind of thing you don't always know you needed until you're already in the middle of it. And one last thing. There's a video right alongside this one that picks up where this story leaves off in its own way. A different story, a different scene, but the same thread running through it. The hidden things, the unexpected moments, the truths that only reveal themselves when something stops us in our tracks. Click on it and come with me. I think you'll want to see where it goes.